It happened in a moment I'll never forget. His face was cold, his tone sharp, his eyes empty. We were standing in the kitchen after yet another argument that had spiraled out of control. My hands were trembling, my heart pounding in my chest, when he leaned against the counter and let the words fall like a dagger, "You're nothing without me." The silence that followed was deafening. At first, I didn't even process it. I thought maybe I misheard him. But then he repeated it, slower this time, as if savoring the cruelty. "You are nothing without me." It's strange how words can weigh more than fists. They leave no bruises on your skin, but they leave scars on your soul. And that night, his words cut deeper than anything he had ever done before. I felt myself shrink like I was collapsing inward. It was as if he had ripped the ground out from beneath me, leaving me suspended in emptiness. Because some part of me believed him. I had built my life around him. I had sacrificed friendships, opportunities, pieces of myself, just to make the relationship work. I had convinced myself that love meant giving everything, even when it left me with nothing. And in that moment, when he looked at me with contempt, I realized how dangerous that belief had become. But I didn't speak. Not then. I stood frozen, tears burning in my eyes, unable to find words, unable to defend myself. My silence only made him smirk, as if he had won some invisible battle. Carl Jung once said, "The world will ask you who you are, and if you do not know, the world will tell you." That night he tried to tell me who I was. Nothing. And for a while, I almost believed him. The days that followed blurred together. His words echoed in every corner of my mind. "You're nothing without me." I heard it when I brushed my teeth in the morning, when I sat at my desk at work, when I tried to fall asleep at night. It became a haunting refrain, a cruel soundtrack to my life. I replayed every moment of our relationship, looking for proof that maybe he was right. He had been the provider, the one with the bigger paycheck, the one who always made decisions. I had leaned on him for so much. Was I really nothing without him? I started to notice the ways he had slowly chipped away at me. The jokes about how I'd never survive on my own. The subtle digs about how I wasn't ambitious enough, strong enough, smart enough. The way he'd remind me of my mistakes but never my wins. Each comment, each dismissal had been a thread. And together, those threads had woven a cage around me. And then, with one sentence, he locked the door. But something else began to stir inside me. Because while his words hurt, they also planted a seed. If he was right, if I was truly nothing without him, then what did that say about me? And if he was wrong, if I was something, if I was everything, then maybe it was time I proved it. That was the paradox of his cruelty. His attempt to break me ended up awakening me. Let me ask you, have you ever been told something so cruel, so absolute, that it burned into your memory? Words meant to crush you, but that eventually became the fire that lifted you. If you have, tell me in the comments, share your story, and tell me where you're watching from. Because words like these don't just wound one person, they wound all of us who've heard them. And healing begins when we speak them out loud. I wish I could tell you I left that night, that I looked him in the eye, laughed at his pathetic attempt to belittle me, and walked out the door with my head held high. But that's not how it happened. The truth is, I stayed. I stayed because part of me still believed him, because part of me was afraid, because part of me thought, what if he's right? So I stayed in that house, in that silence, carrying his words like a secret wound. I went through the motions, work, chores, family dinners, but inside I was unraveling. Every decision felt like proof of my inadequacy. Every mistake felt like confirmation of his judgment. But there was another part of me, a quieter part, that refused to die. It whispered, what if he's wrong? What if you are something? What if you are more than enough? And that whisper would become my lifeline, because one day it would grow louder than his voice. And when it did, Everything would change. The breaking point didn't come all at once. It came in fragments, small humiliations that stacked on top of one another until the weight became unbearable. After he said those words, I tried to convince myself he didn't mean them, that he was angry, that he was tired, that he didn't know what he was saying. But deep down, I knew better. Words like that don't come out of nowhere. They are planted, watered, and grown over time. And his words had been growing for years. I began to notice just how often he reminded me of my supposed inadequacy. When I cooked dinner, and it didn't taste exactly the way he liked, you'd starve without me. When I struggled to assemble furniture, fumbling with the pieces, see, you can't do anything on your own. When I worried about paying bills, and he smirked, good thing you have me, otherwise you'd be on the streets. Each comment seemed harmless to outsiders. Jokes, he called them. But jokes repeated enough times start to sound like truth. Carl Jung once said, shame is a soul-eating emotion, and shame was exactly what he fed me, day after day, year after year. At first, I tried to fight back. I told him his words hurt me. I asked him to stop. But instead of compassion, I was met with more ridicule. You're too sensitive. I'm just joking. Can't you take a joke? See, this is why you need me. You fall apart over nothing. And with every dismissal, I fell quieter, until one day I stopped defending myself at all. That was the silence, the fall into the place where his voice was louder than mine, where I measured myself not by who I knew I was, but by who he told me I was. I remember nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying his words, "You're nothing without me." And I believed it. I believed it so much that I stopped dreaming of a life without him. I stopped making plans of my own. I stopped seeing myself as a person with agency, with value, with worth. I became a shadow. And that's what abuse does, not just physical, but emotional abuse. It doesn't just bruise your body, it rewrites your story. It convinces you that you are the side character in your own life, and they are the main character without whom you cannot exist. Let me ask you, have you ever been there? Have you ever let someone's words become so loud in your head that you couldn't hear your own anymore? Have you ever believed someone's version of you instead of your own truth? If you have, then you know how suffocating it feels, like drowning slowly, not in water, but in doubt. That was my life, until the breaking point. Because even in silence, even in shadows, something inside me was still alive. The breaking point came one ordinary afternoon. I was folding laundry when I found a shirt of his with lipstick on the collar. I froze. My heart pounded. My hands shook. When I confronted him, he laughed, actually laughed. And then he said, "Where else would you go? You're nothing without me. You wouldn't last a week on your own." This time something snapped. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't argue. I just stood there looking at him and realized the only reason he said those words so often was because he was terrified of me discovering the truth, that I was more than enough. Carl Jung said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." And in that moment, I began to choose. Not fully, not loudly, not yet, but a seed was planted. If I was nothing without him, then maybe it was time to find out who I could be. The days after that moment were quiet, but the silence had shifted. It wasn't the silence of defeat anymore. It was the silence of planning. I began to write again, something I hadn't done in years. I journaled every night, pouring out my fears, my anger, my hopes. I wrote the words I couldn't yet say out loud. I am not nothing. I'm more. I started saving small amounts of money, unnoticed. I reconnected with a friend he didn't know about. I read books about people who had rebuilt their lives after devastation. They were small steps, invisible steps, but they were mine. And for the first time in years, I began to imagine a world where his words didn't define me. The first steps of rebuilding were almost invisible to anyone else, but to me they were everything. It started with the smallest act of defiance, buying myself flowers. That may sound trivial, but for years I had waited for him to bring them, for him to acknowledge me, for him to make me feel worth celebrating. He rarely did. And so one day I walked into a store, bought a small bouquet, and placed it in a vase on my table. I looked at those flowers and thought, I gave this to myself, no one else. And something shifted. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." For the first time in years, I felt myself waking up. The next step was even smaller, but just as significant. I cooked dinner the way I liked it. For so long, I had adjusted my recipes to his preferences. Less spice, more salt, this instead of that. But that night, I cooked my meal my way. And when I sat down to eat, alone but free, I savored every bite. It wasn't just food. It was proof that I could create joy for myself. The steps grew larger. I applied for a job I had once told myself I wasn't qualified for. My hands trembled as I filled out the application, his voice echoing in my head. You could never handle that. But I hit send anyway. 2 weeks later, I got the call. I was hired. I remember standing in the hallway, phone pressed to my ear, tears streaming down my face. Not because of the job itself, but because I had done it. I had proved him wrong. I was not nothing. From there, it became a series of victories, opening my own bank account separate from his, learning how to manage bills and budgets on my own, reconnecting with old friends he had pushed away, taking a class I had always wanted to try, walking into a gym, nervous but determined, and discovering strength I didn't know I had. Each action was a brick, and brick by brick I was building a foundation that no one could tear down again. But the most powerful step came quietly. One night, I sat alone on the balcony, looking up at the stars, and I whispered out loud, I am not nothing. I am everything I need. The words felt strange at first, heavy in my mouth, but the more I said them, the lighter I felt. And then it hit me. His voice was no longer the loudest in my head. Mine was. Let me ask you, have you ever taken a small step, one that seemed insignificant to others, but to you it felt like reclaiming your soul? Buying yourself something, making a choice just for you, daring to try again. If you have, then you know the power of small steps. Because it's never about the step itself, it's about what it represents. Proof that you are capable, proof that you are worthy, proof that you are more than the lies you've been told. And as I kept walking, as I kept proving to myself that I was everything he said I wasn't, I realized something even more profound. I wasn't rebuilding to show him. I wasn't rebuilding to prove him wrong. I was rebuilding to prove myself right, because deep down, even when I believed his words, there was always a part of me that whispered, you are more. You always were. The small steps became bigger. Promotions at work, a new apartment, a growing circle of friends who saw me, not as fragile, not as weak, but as strong. And each time I reached a new milestone, I remembered the words he had thrown at me. You're nothing without me. And I smiled. Because with every step, I was proving the opposite. I was everything, alone. Transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's slow, steady, often invisible to the outside world, until one day it isn't. One day it shines so brightly that no one can deny it, not even the person who once tried to convince you that you were nothing. The small steps I had taken became habits, and the habits became pillars, and from those pillars I began to build a life I had once thought impossible. The first big transformation came at work. When I first started, I was timid. I second-guessed myself, carried his voice in my head. You're not capable. You'll fail. But with each project I completed, each challenge I faced, I proved to myself that I could handle it. My boss noticed, my colleagues noticed, and eventually I noticed. Within a year, I was promoted. The same person who once believed she couldn't do anything without him was now leading a team. The day I was handed the promotion letter, I sat in my car and cried, not because of the title, but because of the proof. Proof that I wasn't nothing, proof that I was more than enough. The next transformation came in my personal life. For so long, I had been isolated, cut off from friends and even family by his control. Rebuilding those connections was hard, awkward at first, but slowly I reached out. I met a friend for coffee. I called a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. I said yes to invitations instead of hiding in silence. And with every conversation, every laugh, every shared story, I felt myself come alive again. Carl Jung wrote, "Loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important. For years, I had been unable to share myself. Now, I was learning to connect again, and in that connection, I discovered that I was never truly alone. But the greatest transformation was internal. For the first time in my life, I began to love myself. Not in a cliché, self-help kind of way, but in a real, grounded, unshakable way. I looked in the mirror and no longer saw the person he said I was. I saw resilience. I saw strength. I saw someone who had survived words meant to break her and turned them into bricks to build a new foundation. I started traveling, alone. The first trip was terrifying. I sat on the plane, gripping the armrest, wondering if I had made a mistake. But the moment I stepped into a new city, free to choose where to go, what to eat, what to see, I felt unstoppable. Every street I walked was proof. Every meal I enjoyed was proof. Every moment of freedom was proof. I was everything he said I wasn't. Let me ask you, have you ever had that moment of transformation? The one where you realize you're no longer surviving, you're thriving. The one where you look at yourself and think, I did this, me, alone. That moment is priceless. And once you taste it, there's no going back. The transformation didn't erase the pain. His words still echoed sometimes, late at night, in quiet moments. But they no longer had power. They were ghosts. Reminders of a past that no longer defined me. Because now, when I heard them in my memory, "You're nothing without me," I smiled, and I answered back, not to him, but to myself. I am everything without you. The world around me saw the changes too. Friends commented on how different I looked, lighter, brighter. Colleagues respected me, admired me, even strangers could sense it. The confidence, the freedom, the quiet strength that comes from rebuilding yourself piece by piece. I no longer needed his validation. I no longer needed anyone's validation, because I had proven to myself beyond doubt that I was enough, that I was everything, alone. The day of truth came when I least expected it. Years had passed. I had rebuilt my life brick by brick into something solid, something beautiful, something undeniably mine. I had a career I loved, friends who truly saw me, a home filled with warmth and peace. My laughter was real now, not forced. My silence was no longer fear, it was calm. And then, one afternoon, I saw him again. It was at a cafe downtown. I had just finished a meeting and stopped for coffee. When I turned, there he was, sitting alone, his posture slouched, his eyes tired. For a moment, time froze. Memories came rushing back. The kitchen, the smirk, the words, "You're nothing without me." He saw me and his eyes widened. I don't know what he expected, that I would look fragile, broken, begging, that I would shrink under his gaze the way I once did. But instead, I stood taller. I smiled, not for him, but for me. He approached, hesitant. "You look different." "I am," I replied. We sat for a moment, the silence heavy with unspoken history. Then he leaned in, his voice softer, almost apologetic. "I didn't mean what I said back then. You know that, right? You always took things too seriously. The old me would have crumbled, desperate for his approval. But the new me saw through the excuse. "You did mean it," I said calmly, "but it doesn't matter anymore, because you were wrong." His brows furrowed. "Wrong?" I nodded. "You said I was nothing without you, but I've built a life that proves the opposite. I'm everything without you." The words came out steady, clear, powerful, and for the first time I saw him falter. He opened his mouth, searching for a reply, but no words came. Because what could he say? The truth was right in front of him. I wasn't nothing. I was whole, complete, free. Carl Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." And that became the anthem of my life. I was not the cruel words spoken to me. I was not the shadow he tried to cast. I was not the nothing he wanted me to believe I was. I was what I chose to become, and I chose to become everything. Leaving that cafe, I didn't feel triumph or revenge. I didn't need him to suffer. I didn't need him to regret, because this was never about him. It was about me. The real victory wasn't proving him wrong. It was proving myself right. It was choosing to love myself when he told me I was unlovable. It was choosing to trust myself when he told me I was incapable. It was choosing to become more when he told me I was nothing. That was the victory. That was the freedom. So if you're listening to this and you've ever been told you're nothing, let me tell you this: you are not nothing. You never were. You are everything you choose to be. Tell me in the comments, what cruel words have you turned into fuel? What lie did someone tell you that you've proven wrong? Subscribe if this story spoke to you, because here we turn pain into power and wounds into wisdom. Share this with someone who needs to hear. They are already enough, with or without anyone else's approval. And I'll leave you with Jung's words one last time. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And who I am is proof that even the cruelest words can become the foundation of the strongest life.